Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to my Sunday Miscellany video for this week. This is a formerly weekly series of videos where I give a reading update and talk about some of the highlights from the music that I've listened to and some of the movies that I've watched. And obviously it has been 2 weeks since I did one of these. I didn't mean to miss 2 weeks. I meant to miss 1 week. I meant to take 1 week off just to rest up a bit. It was end of semester crunch for me. I'm now off. I'm done for the summer. I still have work to do over the summer, but it's all my own research that I'll be doing, so that's wonderful. And I'll also be teaching, which will be really cool. So now I have more energy, and I also kind of think that I am going to make these videos every other week from now on, rather than every single week, just because it's hard to have enough to talk about in every video. And they also take and so doing them every other week will give me more time to finish books. But also, these videos just take a lot of time and energy for me to make. They're often very long videos. I have to edit them a lot with, the movie covers that I put up. I often end up doing them in a couple of different attempts, Sometimes I'm not happy with the way a certain take of the video is going and I have to start over. And so they just suck a lot of time out of my day and a lot of energy from me. And obviously the weekend is primarily where I do most of my booktube filming. And so because I'm spending so much time on one of my 2 weekend days on this particular video, that I think is taking a lot of the energy and time I would have for other videos I might do. And I want to be able to have the time and energy to do other videos other than Sunday Miscellanies. But I also really enjoy these, so I don't want to stop doing them. So I'm going to post one of these once every other week, and rather than talk about everything in terms of what I've watched and listened to, instead of talk about everything, I'll just talk about the highlights. I think for films, I will list off the films that I watched, and if you are curious to hear about any of them, you can ask me in the comments, but I will talk in depth about only two. One that is a rewatch and one that I watched for the first time. And with the music, I'll just do what I usually do and leave a playlist of some of the best stuff that I've listened to. So a little bit of a change to my Sunday Miscellanies, but they're still going to be here because I love doing them. I know there's a vocal minority who really like these videos. I know not everyone watches them, but yeah, I enjoy them enough, and enough people enjoy them that I want to keep doing them. So anyway, that was a long preamble, but I will jump in. I always start these off with the music, and I always leave a link to a Spotify playlist of the musical highlights from the week, and obviously it's been like 3 weeks, so this playlist this week is rather long, and it has a lot in it. And I won't talk in depth about each one, but it has quite a variety. So it has some Alex G, a young singer-songwriter, American singer-songwriter. There's some classical. There's some Modest Mussorgsky from his Pictures at an Exhibition. There's Sibelius's Violin Concerto. There's like some pop music as well that I've been listening to, both old and newer stuff. Some opera. I listened to a little bit of Pavarotti, an album of Pavarotti singing, and also Maria Callas, one of my favorite sopranos. There's some Nat King Cole in there that I've listened to. There's some music by Flat Sound, who is another young American singer-songwriter. There's a string quartet by Beethoven in there. There's some Nirvana. There's a little bit of sort of more contemporary classical by Hildur Guðnadóttir, Icelandic composer. And there's a song by Françoise Hardy. A nice variety of pop and classical and everything, and some things in between. So anyway, yeah, so that's what I'll do with the music. I will move on now to the books, which is probably what most of you kind of care about. And I have finished, since my last Miscellany video, 4 books. And they've been an interesting set. So the first one that I finished is one that I did manage to talk about in a Miscellany video before I took my break. That's Talking Pictures, How to Watch Movies by Anne Hornaday, which is just a short discussion of how to watch movies. And Anne Hornaday is a film critic who I believe works for the Washington Post. Yes, Washington Post. And she has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for her criticism. So She has some chops. And so this book is very simple. It's just divided into 7 chapters plus an epilogue, and each chapter covers a different aspect of filmmaking. So chapter 1 is about the screenplay, then you have a chapter about acting, production design, cinematography, editing, sound and music, directing, and then there's an epilogue called Was It Worth Doing? So was the movie worth watching, you know? And so she just goes through sort of the basics of how to discern what is good directing, what's a good screenplay, what's good production design, what makes for good cinematography, good editing, and so on and so forth. Just really going through the basics. And I think if you're a seasoned film buff, this probably may end up being a little bit basic for you. For me, as someone who considers himself a relative neophyte, it was illuminating at times. I especially found the sound mixing part very interesting. Apparently in movies, people will occasionally edit in the sound of an empty room. Like, literally, they will just record the sound of an empty room and then impose that sound on a scene, rather than just letting the sound naturally occur in the scene. I thought that was really funny, but yeah, so I found that interesting. Yeah, but on the whole, it was pretty basic, but I enjoyed it. She tipped me off to a lot of movies that I want to see. There's one thing that's great is she, uses examples from many classic movies, and when she talks about a great movie, it would just make me want to watch it, and that's just a pleasure. So there's a whole set of movies now that I need to see based on what she's recommended, and each chapter actually ends with a set of recommendations of recommended viewing to get good examples of great of great sound mixing or great directing or whatever. And so that also provided some recommendations. So this was fun. I had a lot of fun reading this. Again, if you're a seasoned film buff, it's going to be a little bit basic, but if you're a newbie, or if you just like reading stuff like this, I could recommend it. And then I obviously also finished reading Njal Saga. I read it in this Penguin Classic edition that's edited with an introduction and translation by Robert Cook. I read this as a part of Saga-long, which is a yearly read-along of Icelandic sagas that I host with a number of other people, and we focused just on Njal Saga for the entire month. We did a big, long read-along, and we had a lot of fun in the Voxer chat group that we have. That was just a lot of fun. The people who were hosting are just hilarious. But the book itself was also absolutely fantastic. It certainly is going to be, I think, one of my favorite works of literature now. Certainly one of my favorite sort of pre-modern works of literature, pre-Renaissance, I suppose, works of literature. It does kind of end with a whimper instead of a bang, which is kind of a shame, but on the whole, it is a really interesting and powerful piece of work, I think, and I will definitely be returning to it, and I can see why it's considered to be the greatest of the sagas. So I read that, and I also did 4 videos for Saga-long about that, so you can check those out if you want to hear more in-depth thoughts. I also, last week, finished 2 books that I'm going to be doing individual videos on, so I won't go too in-depth on them here. But the first one is The Evidence for God, The Case for the Existence of the Spiritual Dimension by Keith Ward, which kind of has a self-explanatory title. Keith Ward is an Anglican priest and a professor emeritus at Oxford University. And I gotta say, this was a really bad book. It's just one of the most intellectually sloppy books I've read in a long, long time. There were aspects of it that I was on board with. I kind of like his approach. He doesn't approach providing evidence for God by trying to lay out logical proofs or something like that, or an argument from design, although he does sort of veer in close towards the argument from the design at times. But he mostly avoids kind of trying to argue based on logic or science or anything like that, although he does talk about science a lot in the book. He mostly argues through sort of our own subjective experience of the world and tries to show that is itself kind of evidence for the existence of a spiritual dimension, as he calls it, or for spirit, which he does label as God throughout the book, but which, you don't have to label as God. And I was on board with that, because I think that that's a much more interesting approach than logical proofs, which always at some point fall apart, right? There's really no logical proof for God's existence that it holds up to scrutiny. But there's just so much in here that's problematic. There's circular reasoning, unspoken assumptions, both his own unspoken assumptions that underlie his own views, but also the assumptions he makes about materialism, about materialists, and about science as well. And you know, just deductive arguments that just don't add up logically. It's just full with errors. I was underlining and annotating every other page or so, writing in some sort of quibble or argument or, you know, scolding of his reasoning. It really by the end felt like a bit of a waste of time. There is a little bit towards the end of the book about just religion in general and spirituality in religion that I found rather interesting, but mostly because it was just about religion rather than about him trying to provide evidence for God. So anyway, yeah, can't recommend this, unfortunately. But the next book I absolutely can recommend, and I'm going to talk even less about this one because I'm actually going to be doing a recorded Zoom chat on the book with Weston from Weston Hart's Words. And the book is My Bright Abyss, a Meditation of a Modern Believer by Christian Wiman, which is basically a collection of memoiristic essays about Christian Wiman's own faith and how the role it plays in his life, how he thinks about it, what he feels about faith in general, and also how it applies to the events of his life. He was diagnosed with an incurable form of cancer when he was, I think, in his early 30s. And so that really informed his faith. And actually, it was after he found out about his diagnosis that he found religion again. He was raised in a fundamentalist, I don't know if it's fundamentalist, but a very religious community in West Texas, and then grew up, went to college, lost his faith, became an atheist, but then he got his diagnosis and suddenly found religion again. And this book isn't a memoir, really. There's not that much about his cancer or his life. He touches on it here and there, but it's not a memoir. It's more of a collection of essays that are lightly autobiographical. And what he also talks about a lot is poetry, and the role that poetry plays in his religious faith and in his view of the world and his view of, you know, suffering and so on. And so there's a lot of poetry that he quotes from and analyzes in the book, and it's all just fabulous. You know, I was talking to Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse last night about the book, because this is like one of Jason's favorite books of all time, and I told Jason that it seemed like no matter how slow I read the book, it wasn't slow enough, you know, because it's just chock full of A, brilliant sentences, but also B, just incredibly subtle insights, you know, insights that you have to wrestle with and chew on, that you can't just read and you know, file into the file drawer in the back of your head and move on. You really have to do something with them. And there's something like that on almost every page of the book. And so it is just a remarkable book, and I cannot wait to talk about it with Weston. And Weston is a Quaker, and Weston has a rather interesting background insofar as they grew up non-religious or as an atheist, and then became a Quaker, I believe, in their early 20s or something like that. And I'm an atheist, though, and I'm non-religious, so it'll be an interesting conversation about the book, and we're kind of hashing out right now when we're going to do it, how we're going to sort of frame it, and so on. But yeah, really, really good book. Can highly recommend that. And now I move on to the books that I am currently working on, and I'm reading some great stuff. And a couple of them are buddy reads, and that's wonderful. I am currently making my way through At Play in the Fields of the Lord by Peter Matthiessen, which is a historical novel that takes place in the middle of the 20th century in the rainforest in South America. And it's about a man named Martin Querier, who is a Protestant missionary, and another man named Louis Moon, who is basically a mercenary who is half Native American himself. And Martin Querier has traveled to the rainforest to convert the Nyaruna peoples of the rainforest, the indigenous people. And Louis Moon has been hired to exterminate the Nyaruna, so that the forest can be cleared and farmed and quote-unquote developed. And so the book is a lot about Martin Querrier's faith, and a lot about colonialism and racism, which is something that, and genocide, which is probably the aspect of the book that I'm finding the most interesting. I'm fascinated by Louis Moon as a character because he is half Native American. You find out a lot about his background growing up on a reservation and his sort of motives for the life he's living, right? Because he himself was raised Native American, and yet here he is exterminating the indigenous inhabitants of another part of the Americas, right? And that causes a lot of sort of dissonance for him. But he's just a fascinating character. And then there's Martin Querrier, who obviously is having his faith challenged by people like Louis Moon and the other men he meets, many of whom are incredibly depraved, and by the people in this jungle, who obviously are not Christians. So it is a really fascinating book. Great writing, great dialogue. There are some fascinating conversations that take place in this book so far. It is turning into a really great reading experience. I'm more than a third of the way through, so I'm hoping to have it finished by the end of the week. I will probably be able to review it in my next Miscellany video. So anyway, but that's great. And then two of my buddy reads are What Are We Doing Here? Essays by Marilynne Robinson, in which she discusses all the themes that have permeated all of her nonfiction, Calvinism, American history, science and religion, and the crossing between science and religion, and so on and so forth. And this is a buddy read with Karen Evans, and that is turning into a fabulous buddy read. Karen is a person of faith, and I obviously am not, and so that is an interesting dynamic, but it's just turning into a great conversation, and there are some really interesting essays. I have had to really wrestle with some of the essays in here, because I do find Marilynne Robinson's view of science sometimes problematic. I think she oversimplifies sometimes. I think she equates things that you shouldn't really equate, and occasionally she sees two things as different when I think that they're actually the same thing. And so when she talks about science and materialism and the materialist view of the world, I think she gets onto shaky ground, and I tend to disagree with her, and I've been very vocal to Karen about that when we've come to it. But on the whole, this is just like the Christian Wiman, like on every page there is something to digest and chew on. It's a book that I read really slowly. Even just a 15-page essay will take me 45 minutes to read, because I just need to slow down and absorb the subtle insights that she has. It is so interesting comparing Marilynne Robinson and Christian Wiman as writers and as sort of intellects, because they're obviously both people of faith, they're both brilliant, and they have similar sensibilities. They even cite a fair number of the same writers. They both really like Wallace Stevens, for example, who of course is my favorite poet, so that makes me very happy. But their writing style is so much different. Christian Wiman wears his learning very lightly. He is just every bit as well-read and intelligent, and, he seems to have so much, he seems to possess so much of literature in him, but he wears that learning very lightly, whereas Marilynne Robinson is very much wearing the hat of a scholar. She will lay out a block quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, right? She will talk about historical events, and she will reference these obscure primary documents that she's been reading. And, and her language is also very angular and academic. Not in a way that's impenetrable, but just in a way that's very sort of frank, right? And intellectual. Whereas Christian Wiman's prose style is highly sort of poetic, right? And so it's so interesting kind of reading the two at the same time, because they're similar sensibilities, similar arguments, but completely different approaches to the subject. And I probably personally am a bit closer to Marilynne Robinson in my own approach to things, but that's just because I'm in academia, right? And then another buddy read that I'm still in the middle of is 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created by Charles Mann. This is all about how Columbus's so-called discovery of the so-called New World changed the whole face of the world, ecologically, sociologically, ethnically, population-wise, economically, religiously, and so on and so forth. And it's not quite the paradigm-shifting, mind-blowing read that 1491 was, because that book just blew my brains out in almost every chapter. But this one is still fascinating. I'm still learning a lot. You know, I'd never thought of the environmental impact of the discovery of the New World, right? The impact that it had on the ecology of the Americas and of Europe and of Asia. It's just remarkably interesting. And so I'm learning a lot from the book. We're having it's a buddy read with Patrice Jones and Peg from the History Shelf, and we're kind of a power trio when it comes to buddy reads of history, and so it's great. So this is really good. We're chipping away at it, reading one chapter a week. And then I'm also, this is my last, or no, actually I have one more book. Book I'm going to start tomorrow is The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. I'm buddy reading that with Noah from Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse, and Jasmine from To the Lit House, and I'm really looking forward to that. We're gonna do a live stream together and discuss it, so look out for that, but that will probably happen in a couple of weeks. So we'll be starting that tomorrow. And then another book that I'm just chipping away at still is When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, a Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry edited by Joy Harjo, and this is fabulous. I'm finding so many new poems that are just wonderfully powerful. And the introduction by Joy Harjo was excellent as well. And I love that it was edited by Joy Harjo. I love her work. I love her memoir, Crazy Brave. And she obviously is the Poet Laureate of the United States, the first Native American to hold that post. It shouldn't have taken until 2019 for that to happen, but anyway. But yeah, I love that she edited it, and I'm loving a lot of the poetry, and yeah. So anyway, those are the books, and now I will move on to the films. Obviously, it's been a couple weeks, so I've watched quite a few films, and so I will list them off very quickly. I watched Jojo Rabbit, directed by Taika Waititi, Sunshine State, directed by John Sayles, Blue Jasmine, directed by Woody Allen, Annie Hall, also directed by Woody Allen, Stroszek, directed by Werner Herzog, Irma Vep, directed by Olivier Assayas, Manhattan, directed by, again, Woody Allen, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which was a rewatch, directed by Hayao Miyazaki, Princess Mononoke, also directed by Miyazaki and also a rewatch, My Neighbors the Yamadas, directed by Isao Takahata, Hunt for the Wilder People, also directed by Taika Waititi. The Elephant Man, directed by David Lynch. The first David Lynch I'd seen other than Dune, which is not a good David Lynch. And then I also rewatched Yi Yi, directed by Edward Yang. And I, last night, on a whim, rewatched The Tree of Life, directed by Terrence Malick, my favorite film of all time. So, yeah, a lot of films. And I am only going to talk about one that I have watched for the first time and one that I rewatched. And the one that I will talk about that's new to me is Blue Jasmine, directed by Woody Allen. This stars Kate Winslet, who is a woman who has recently been widowed. Her husband committed suicide after he was found to have been committing fraud in his business. He was a very wealthy man, very successful businessman, and so Kate Winslet's character is very used to this wealthy, high-style New York life in New York City. And now that her husband has been found out as a fraud, she's basically lost everything. So, you know, she has no money anymore, her husband is dead, her son hates her son won't talk to her, and so she moves across the country to live with her sister, who is played by Sally Hawkins, who is more middle class. And it's about their relationship, it's about her relationship with her husband. So we see the relationship between Cate Blanchett and Sally Hawkins play out in the present, and then we get flashbacks to Kate Winslet's marriage, and we see the way that played out, and the way that the discovery of her husband's fraud played out, and some juicy details are revealed, and Cate Blanchett, wants to get educated. She doesn't know how to use a computer, so she takes a class on how to use a computer, which is kind of funny. And she gets a job as a dentist assistant and struggles a lot with anxiety and depression, and tries to start a new relationship with a different man, and lies to this man about her past, and tells him, that she has this sunny, nice past, when in reality, obviously, that she has a very dark past. And it's just a great film, and what I think is great about it is Cate Blanchett. I love Cate Blanchett. I've loved her for a long time, and I've seen her in a lot of things, but I think this is my favorite performance by her, actually. She is just astounding. Mark Kermode, the great film critic, called it a towering performance, and yeah, I would agree, it is a towering performance. And what I think is remarkable about her performance is that this character she plays is not very sympathetic. She is spoiled, she's the epitome of first world problems. She is selfish, abrasive, thoughtless, and yet Cate Blanchett gets you to sympathize with her, or at least gets me to sympathize with her. I'm kind of high on the empathy scale. I find it very easy to empathize with people, and I tend to feel bad for people very easily. And so maybe the fact that I was convinced by Cate Blanchett's performance isn't saying that much, but I think it's such a remarkable performance. Yeah, it was great. Sally Hawkins is also really good, but I think Cate Blanchett just kind of dominates this film so completely that it was hard for me to really care about anyone else. Well, no, I mean, I did. The other characters are interesting. I did care about them, but I was really just focusing on Cate Blanchett. So Blue Jasmine was absolutely fabulous. And then I thought I would talk a little bit about Princess Mononoke. And this film, I saw it for the first time when I must have been like 7 or 8. I mean, it came out for the first time when I was probably like 5 or 6. And so I've watched it many, many times. I still actually vividly remember the first time I watched it. It was a movie that my mom and I decided to rent from the library. We just kind of saw it, thought it looked cool, and grabbed it. And it was such an intense experience watching it. And, there's a famous blurb of Princess Mononoke where it says that it's the Star Wars of animated films, and I just completely agree, because there is this, archetypal aspect to it where it almost feels like it feels ageless. It does feel like a piece of mythology, more than something that a modern storyteller created out of his own imagination, which is what it is. And what I really like about Princess Mononoke is that there really isn't any actual villain in the movie. I mean, there are people you can point to as more and less sympathetic, but really there is no villain. And even characters who are criticized and who do bad things have redeeming qualities. My favorite character actually in the movie is Lady Eboshi, who is the leader of Irontown, this place called Irontown, which is sort of mining, iron out of this out of this mountain. And in order to do that, they've been clearing the forest, and that has been angering the spirit of the forest, among others, including Princess Mononoke herself, who is a human who is raised by a wolf god, who is basically just this giant white wolf. And that's probably another reason that I love the movie, because I love wolves, and this has 3 giant wolves in it. But the Lady Eboshi is in conflict with nature, right? She's chopping down trees constantly. She wants to kill the spirit of the forest, which is a heinous act in the eyes of many, and so on and so forth. But she also is incredibly sympathetic. She employs women who were formerly working as prostitutes. She helped them get out of the bad situations they were in, and gave them a job, gave them a living. And a lot of these women, now live comfortably in Irontown. She also takes in lepers, people with leprosy, who have been ostracized in most places in the world throughout history, and she gives these people a place to live. And many of the people she employs are former criminals, people who just had a rough time in life. And so you see the sympathy that she has for people, right? It's just that she doesn't extend that sympathy to nature. And that's sort of her big character arc over the course of the film. She learns to respect nature. And there's growth there. That's what I like too, is that she's a flawed character who grows by the end, right? And yeah, so and I feel like that is just the heart of the movie, right? Yeah, so I love Princess Mononoke. There's a lot to talk about with it. But anyway, and the soundtrack by Joe Hisaishi is astounding. So anyway, I will leave it at that. If you want to know anything about my thoughts on the other films I listed, then just ask in the comments, and I'm happy to chat. And if you want to talk about anything I mentioned in this video, just let me know. And anyway, I will leave it at that. Talk to you all later. Bye.